The Anatomy of Conflict. Why we fight, how we break, and how we come back together. This book begins in the body, not the mind. Conflict doesn't start with disagreement. It begins the moment dignity feels threatened. In that instant, the nervous system moves before thought. The body speaks first. The story comes later. This is not a book about being right. It is a book about remaining yourself in the heat of conflict, without collapsing and without turning to stone. Because conflict is the place where the self reveals the parts of itself it has forgotten, the parts still asking to be seen, still asking to be integrated. So take a breath. Let the pace slow. Feel your own presence gather. This quiet library edition is the distilled version of a full book released by the strategic mind, shaped for clarity, calm, and directness, without losing the depth of the original. Written by Aaron Kairos. Narrated by Lyra Celine. Preface. This is not a book about winning arguments. It is a book about remaining yourself when the world, or another person, presses against you. Conflict is not failure. It is the moment when the self meets its own history. Every clash contains a wound trying to speak and a dignity trying to hold itself together. On the surface, it looks like disagreement, but beneath it lives the trembling architecture of memory, fear, and longing. Most people never see this. They believe conflict is about the other person, their flaws, their timing, their tone. They do not realize the argument is rarely about content. It is almost always about meaning, and the meaning is almost always personal. A fear of being unseen, a terror of abandonment, a reflex to protect dignity. Conflict reveals not who the other is, but who you have been without noticing. To understand conflict is to understand your own interior world, the shape of your nervous system, the emotional inheritance of childhood, the reflexes formed long before language, the survival strategies built to manage closeness or distance. Conflict is where your oldest stories surface and ask whether you will repeat them or rewrite them. Mastery is not avoidance. Avoidance is fear wearing calmness as disguise. Mastery is the ability to stay present when the old self would have fled, collapsed, or attacked. It is remaining grounded inside intensity, holding your dignity without crushing another's, speaking without turning language into a blade, and staying in the room without abandoning either the bond or yourself. You do not read this book to learn how to win. Winning is the quickest way to lose truth. You read it to learn how to stay awake. Awake to your patterns, your protections, the wound beneath your reactions, and the dignity beneath your defenses. Awake to the deeper question, not who is right, but what is true here, and what does my reaction reveal about me? Conflict is not the opposite of connection. It is the gateway to it. This book is the map. Note to the reader. There is nothing wrong with you for struggling in conflict. No one taught you how to stay present when your nervous system contracts, or how to protect dignity without closing your heart, or how to remain yourself when the past suddenly enters the room. This book will not tell you to communicate better or stay calm, because you already know how when you are not hurt. This book is for the moments when you are hurt, when breath shortens, tone sharpens, the chest tightens, and the self you mean to be slips out of reach. You are not reading to become perfect. You are reading to become present. Move slowly through these pages. Let them settle in your body, not just your mind. If something stirs you, pause, breathe, and notice what it shows you. Conflict is not a flaw. It is part of your becoming. This book is not here to judge you. It is here to walk with you, quietly, steadily, back to yourself. Introduction. Most people think conflict begins with disagreement, But it begins far earlier, in the body, in the 1-second window before thought. A gesture, a pause, a tone. The nervous system interprets them before language arrives. A raised eyebrow becomes threat. A silence becomes rejection. A question becomes accusation. Long before words are exchanged, the body has already decided whether it is safe, valued, or at risk of shrinking. Conflict originates not in the mind, but in ancient circuitry built to protect dignity, belonging, and survival. This is why conflict feels overwhelming. We are rarely reacting to the person before us. We are reacting to the meaning our history assigned to them in an instant. A tone that echoes an old criticism, a silence that resembles abandonment, a sigh that awakens humiliation. Suddenly, the present dissolves. The body charges with electricity, and the mind constructs a story to justify the reaction already underway. What we call the argument is often a narrative formed after the nervous system has fired. Most advice focuses on behavior. Communicate better, listen openly, calm down, negotiate. But conflict does not begin in logic, and logic cannot resolve it. You cannot stay regulated when the body believes it is threatened. You cannot listen well when dignity feels endangered. This book, therefore, speaks first to the body, where conflict actually happens. To understand conflict, you must see its internal architecture, how the nervous system scans for danger, how the past overlays the present, how tone reveals emotional truth, how identity tightens when dignity is at stake, how escalation unfolds step by step, and how survival reflexes, dominance, retreat, and freeze, shape the entire exchange. You will learn the mechanics that operate beneath every rupture. But this is also a book about repair, restoring dignity, reestablishing presence, and returning to connection without collapsing or overpowering. It explores the pivot, the moment when one person chooses truth over defense, and the reintegration that follows, rebuilding trust, stitching the bond into something stronger and more conscious than before. Conflict is not a failure of relationship. It is where relationship becomes real. Ultimately, this is a book about sovereignty, the ability to remain yourself under pressure, to protect your dignity without harming another's, to speak without wounding, and to stay present without disappearing. Sovereignty is connection without self-loss. When you inhabit this posture, conflict becomes a teacher, revealing the fears that still guide you, the wounds that still shape you, and the truths that want expression. You will not be asked to avoid conflict. You will be asked to walk through it awake, to sense its currents, name its meanings, and stay present in its intensity. When you do, conflict becomes not the place where bonds break, but the place where they deepen, and where the self becomes clear. Part 1. The Instinct of Conflict. Where conflict begins. Chapter 1. Life as tension. Conflict is not an interruption, but the pulse that sustains life. Peace as the natural condition is a comforting myth. Existence emerges from pressure. Breath is a negotiation between opposing forces. Muscles strengthen under strain. Ecosystems hold equilibrium through predator and prey. Even stars survive by balancing collapse and explosion. Without tension, nothing forms or endures. Life is the choreography of opposing pressures. To live is to hold forces in dynamic balance. To deny conflict is to deny the mechanics of being alive. 1. Life must protect itself to remain itself. Every living thing survives inside a boundary distinguishing what is self from what is not self. Too soft, identity dissolves. Too rigid, growth stops. Life is therefore active differentiation. the ongoing assertion of form. When the self says, "This is me," it simultaneously declares, "This is not me." That boundary generates tension, and tension generates conflict. Conflict begins the moment identity forms. It is not born of anger or ideology, but of the ancient reflex to preserve cohesion against dissolution. 2. Conflict begins inside the self. External clashes echo deeper internal contradictions. The psyche contains competing drives: safety versus expansion, approval versus autonomy, exposure versus restraint. We react most intensely to tensions we haven't integrated. When worth feels unstable, we chase recognition. When vulnerability threatens, we grasp for control. Conflict style reflects inner architecture. Collapse, belonging bought through surrender. Escalation, intensity as the only path to being heard. Chaos, volatility mistaken for aliveness. Avoidance, silence equated with safety. Conflict exposes where the inner blueprint is unfinished. 3. Conflict appears when two boundaries meet. Difference does not cause conflict. Overlapping boundaries do. Conflict emerges when two selves claim the same territory: physical, emotional, symbolic, or conceptual. The right question is not who is right, but what boundary is being defended, and why does it feel indispensable? Fear, history, and vulnerability often hide beneath the surface. Seen this way, conflict becomes structural, not moral. 4. Conflict is not about the present moment. The trigger is rarely the cause. Conflict is fueled by memory. The nervous system reacts to patterns, not events. A tone, a silence, a gesture can summon old wounds instantly. The body moves before the intellect explains. Reasoning fails when the body still believes it is reliving danger. To work with conflict, one must speak in the body's language: safety, breath, pacing, presence. Without that, the mind invents narratives to justify its fear. 5. Conflict is not a problem to eliminate. Modern culture treats harmony as health and conflict as failure. This produces dishonesty and emotional starvation. Forced peace requires someone to shrink, hide, or disappear. Conflict is feedback, showing where truth presses against suppression, where boundaries have been crossed, where illusion meets reality. A life without conflict is rigid. A relationship without conflict is built on erasure. Intimacy requires friction. Leadership requires decision. Maturity requires confronting limits. Peace is not the absence of conflict, but the capacity to move through it without losing dignity or connection. Conflict is not pathology. It is the mechanism through which growth enters a relationship, and the discipline through which identity stays alive. Chapter 2. Threat, territory, and the nervous system. The body enters conflict long before the mind knows one has begun. Before thought, before argument, the nervous system scans for danger and answers the oldest question: am I safe? We imagine ourselves rational, but conflict starts in the primitive circuitry built for survival, not conversation. It reads tone, movement, breath, not meaning. The mind arrives late and invents explanations. As Damasio wrote, feeling precedes thinking. Conflict makes this undeniable. 1. All conflict begins as a threat response. Threat is not just violence. For social beings, threat means possible loss, belonging, dignity, identity, control. A flat tone or delayed reply can trigger the same alarm the body once reserved for predators. Two people can share a moment, yet inhabit different realities because threat perception is personal and historical. Conflict is rarely about the event. It's about what the nervous system interpreted. 2. Territory is psychological, not physical. Animals defend land. Humans defend meaning. Modern territories are intangible: dignity, emotional space, role, interpretation, worth. Challenge any of these, and the body reacts as if invaded. Corrections feel like breaches, advice like occupation. People defend trivial positions fiercely because the true battle is over psychic territory, the felt sense of mine. 3. The nervous system reacts faster than thought. The amygdala fires in 40 milliseconds. Reasoning takes 600. By the time thought appears, posture has stiffened, breath shortened, and voice hardened. This is why logic fails mid-conflict. You cannot think your way out of a state the body is already in. The way back to clarity is physical. Slower exhale, softer jaw, open posture. Only once the alarm quiets does the mind return. 4. The body remembers what the mind forgets. The body stores traces of shame, abandonment, and fear. When the present echoes an old wound, a tone, a look, a silence, the nervous system sounds the original alarm. This creates disproportionate reactions. The conflict is not about dishes or lateness, but about a resurrected memory. I wasn't heard. I wasn't valued. I was small. The body treats remembered pain as real and mobilizes instantly. 5. The first work of conflict is stabilization, not solution. Because conflict begins in the body, resolution must begin there too. Reason cannot operate while the nervous system is in alarm. The first task is regulation, not persuasion. Slow the breath, drop the shoulders, reduce vocal force. Lean back, not forward. Allow silence. Calm is not weakness, it is authority. A regulated body becomes stable ground the other can settle into. Self-regulation becomes co-regulation. Conflict collapses the moment at least one body refuses to remain in alarm. Chapter 3. Fear, desire, and the preservation of self. Every conflict hides two currents: fear pulling inward and desire reaching outward. No rupture, personal or political, is driven by aggression alone. Beneath every clash lies something the self is protecting and something it is trying to receive. Fear is what we cannot bear to relive. Desire is what we cannot bear to lose. Conflict lives where these two meet, dignity guarding itself and vulnerability reaching for recognition. Even destruction follows this dual logic. Tyrants fear erasure. Rebels long to be seen. To understand conflict, ask, what am I afraid of? What am I longing for? Where those answers converge, conflict begins. 1. Fear, the memory of being overwhelmed. Fear does not arise from the present. It is the echo of humiliation, abandonment, failure, or invisibility. The body remembers what the mind hides. Defensiveness is the nervous system protecting against old injuries. Never again will I be powerless. A harmless comment can ignite panic when it resembles a past wound. Most conflicts sit atop a few core fears. I do not matter. I will be left. I will be diminished. I am not enough. Behind raised voices lies terror of disappearing. Behind rigidity lies fear of not being acknowledged. Fear distorts the moment into a repetition of the past. 2. Desire, the longing to be met. If fear is the shadow, desire is the flame. Desire reaches for connection, recognition, and emotional safety. Because longing exposes us, it often hides beneath irritation or withdrawal. Beneath every defensive gesture is a plea to be seen, respected, understood, or allowed to belong without shrinking. Even in war or politics, the same whisper remains: do not erase me. What we call winning is often a distorted bid for acknowledgement. Desire and fear are twin poles. Conflict amplifies both. 3. Conflict happens where fear and desire collide. External conflict begins with an internal contradiction, the urge to protect and the urge to connect. We brace while reaching, defend while yearning. The more intense the conflict, the more vulnerable the longing beneath it. We only rage where we care. This volatility is not a relationship's failure, but its depth. We fight for what is sacred. 4. When fear controls the conflict. When fear dominates, everything tightens. The body armors, certainty hardens, and identity becomes brittle. Curiosity disappears. Empathy thins. Interpretation becomes rigid, and accusation replaces inquiry. Survival logic takes over, dividing the world into ally or enemy. In trying to prevent loss, fear creates it. In defending against humiliation, it produces distance. Fear builds the isolation it dreads. 5. When desire controls the conflict. When desire overwhelms, boundaries dissolve. The self leans forward, pleads, persuades, apologizes excessively, or explains endlessly. This is longing without containment, the attempt to merge to avoid abandonment. But desire without boundary becomes dependency, mistaking self-erasure for connection. What feels like closeness becomes depletion. 6. The mature position, holding fear and desire together. Maturity appears when fear and desire can exist together without collapsing into either. The self can say, I am afraid, and I stay. I desire, and I do not beg. This balance creates firmness without aggression, vulnerability without surrender, and dignity without domination. From here, conflict becomes navigable. Negotiation becomes honest. Repair becomes possible. Leadership becomes steady rather than coercive. Maturity is not fearlessness. It is fear that no longer governs action, and desire that no longer dissolves boundaries. In this synthesis, conflict becomes the meeting of two awake selves. The deepest map emerges from two questions. What do I fear losing? What do I hope to gain? Between these coordinates lies the full architecture of human struggle. Part 2. The geometry of conflict. Conflict has shapes. Chapter 4. The scar of memory. Conflict repeats what was never integrated. We do not fight because of the present. We fight because something old reappears in new form. Each person carries emotional memory written not in words, but in posture, tension, and reflex. The moments we were ignored, overpowered, shamed, abandoned, or forced to shrink. When present conditions resemble those injuries, the body responds before thought. Conflict is the body's attempt to finish what history left unfinished, not regression, but the instinct for closure resurfacing through repetition. 1. Memory lives in the body, not the mind. The deepest memories shaping conflict are somatic, not narrative. The body remembers threat and shame long before the mind can articulate them. A partner's silence, a colleague's tone, a child's distance, any of these can activate a response meant for someone long gone. These reactions are buried tripwires. Once triggered, the nervous system fights ghosts rather than people. The mind insists the reaction is irrational. The body insists it is necessary. 2. Conflict returns. What was avoided? What was unfelt or ungrieved resurfaces. Conflict is the psyche attempting to restore integrity by bringing buried material back into awareness. The oversized argument is not irrational, it is overcharged. The present disagreement carries the weight of every earlier moment in the same shape. A forgotten task becomes the echo of old disappointments. The dishwasher is never the dishwasher. It is dignity. 3. The other person becomes an actor in an old scene. In conflict, timelines collapse. A partner becomes the critical parent. A friend's withdrawal becomes early neglect. A child's defiance evokes past humiliation. These misrecognitions are the nervous system seeking completion. Two people argue, each believing the other is the problem, while both reenact scripts written long before they met. Seeing this breaks the spell. Naming the pattern does not erase the wound, but it interrupts the repetition. 4. Repetition is the psyche's attempt at repair. People repeat patterns not out of masochism, but out of longing for resolution. What looks like self-sabotage is often a bid to rewrite history with more agency. We recreate the same dynamic, hoping unconsciously for a different ending. But domination, retreat, or winning never bring completion. Only recognition does, holding steady in the presence of what once overwhelmed us. 5. Most conflict is about the self, not the other. The real questions are, who am I becoming in this moment? Who am I refusing to become again? One fights not to be invisible. Another fights not to be small or abandoned. When these motives surface, conflict becomes revelation rather than attack. The other person becomes a mirror showing the unhealed places. Awareness, more than apology, dissolves hostility. 6. Once the scar is seen, the fight changes. When the core wound is named, the body exhales. Urgency fades. Boundaries sharpen. Dialogue becomes possible. The goal shifts from victory to presence. The deeper inquiry emerges. Can I remain myself in the presence of what once broke me? Integration, not triumph, is the work. To stay whole where we once fractured. To stay conscious where we once dissociated. To stay open where we once collapsed. Conflict is memory seeking healing. Once the scar is seen, the pattern loses authority. The energy once spent in repetition becomes available as strength. Conflict becomes not a trap, but a path. Chapter 5. The line. Opposition. The simplest shape of conflict is the line. You against me. Two forces facing each other, each protecting its boundary. It appears wherever identities collide. My space against yours, my truth against yours, my need against yours. Children discover it early. Nations reenact it endlessly. The line is not inherently violent. It is direct, binary, primal. Under threat, all complexity collapses into this straight path of resistance. 1. The line wants clarity, not understanding. Once drawn, the line erases nuance. A threatened nervous system seeks one answer. Am I safe? Ambiguity feels dangerous, curiosity weak, empathy exposing. The brain narrows to conserve energy, trading complexity for speed. This primitive efficiency helps soldiers react, children protect themselves, and societies unite. But it also turns conversation into confrontation. In the line, truth becomes a weapon, not a bridge. 2. The line turns the other into a symbol. Across the line, the other stops being a person and becomes a symbol of disrespect, betrayal, authority, or threat. This symbolic collapse is automatic, not chosen. A face becomes an emblem, a gesture becomes accusation. Empathy dissolves because the nervous system no longer registers humanity. All wars begin here, abstraction replacing personhood. Conflict cannot resolve until the symbol becomes human again. 3. The line tests boundary strength. The line asks, how intact is your boundary? Strength is not domination, but the ability to stay embodied, to hold your boundary while acknowledging another's. Collapse leads to disappearance. Rigidity leads to destruction. The mature stance is firm yet permeable, a living boundary rather than a wall. It silently says, I remain myself while recognizing you. A regulated body in the line steadies the entire field. 4. Most people only know win or lose. Inside the line, losing feels like annihilation, winning like survival. Ancient circuitry cannot distinguish an argument from mortal threat. This is why people escalate quickly, cling to correctness, or sacrifice relationships for victory. Stress converts ambiguity into a zero-sum contest. The nervous system prefers being right to being close. 5. The work is not to avoid the line, but to see it. The line is foundational. Without it, there is no self. The task is not erasing it, but recognizing it. Ah, this is the line. Recognition restores breath, introduces choice, and loosens reflex. What felt like a trap becomes a map, a coordinate marking where identity asserts itself. From here, conflict can evolve into more complex shapes, such as the triangle of alliances and loyalties. But mastery begins with seeing the line clearly, life defending its outline. Chapter 6. The Triangle. Alliances, Loyalties, Betrayals. No conflict stays between two people for long. The line, me against you, is too unstable. Humans are social. Under threat, we reach for connection. A third is drawn in, called, confided in, recruited, or silently implicated. The line bends into the triangle: alliances, coalitions, scapegoats, betrayals. If the line is personal, the triangle is political. Conflict seeks witness the way fire seeks oxygen. 1. The triangle forms because the self seeks safety in witness. A witness validates experience and relieves the terror of facing conflict alone. We pull in friends, siblings, colleagues, even nations, all driven by the same instinct: see me, or I will disappear. The witness stabilizes the inner narrative but enlarges the conflict. Once a third enters, the field shifts from intimacy to positioning. 2. The triangle changes the conflict, not just the head count. With a third present, conflict becomes strategy. The goal shifts from understanding to controlling perception. Each person now manages two battles, defending themselves and shaping the witness's view. Conflict becomes performance. Words become theater. Vulnerability becomes rehearsed. Resolution weakens as the fight becomes political rather than relational. 3. The triangle is the core of family conflict. Families generate the most intimate and damaging triangles. A child is pulled toward one parent to stabilize tension with the other. It offers adults relief, but distorts the child's sense of love. The child learns that affection requires alliance, belonging is conditional, and loyalty demands betrayal. As adults, they confuse closeness with enmeshment and fear conflict because disagreement feels like abandonment. In such families, the triangle becomes generational inheritance. 4. The triangle is the engine of political power. The same geometry scales to nations. Political conflict thrives through controlled witnesses, crowds, factions, publics. When identity replaces individuality, the triangle becomes combustible. Allies validate grievance. Belonging becomes proof of righteousness. Every ideology and digital mob rests on the same shape, two aligned against a third, bound by shared pain. 5. Alliances are moral maps, not neutral acts. Taking someone's side means stepping into their moral narrative. Alliances forge shared memory and identity. Losing an ally feels like losing a world, not an argument. But the comfort of alliance can blind. Validation becomes anesthetic. The echo chamber replaces growth. Every alliance must be tested. Does this reveal truth or protect me from it? 6. The only way to resolve a triangle is to return to the dyad. A triangle cannot heal while the third remains in the emotional field. Their presence alters honesty and posture. Performance replaces truth. Healing requires collapsing the triangle. Close the door, remove the witness, face the person directly. Only in the dyad can fear be named, dignity restored, and truth spoken without audience. The mature self resists recruiting allies, choosing discomfort over validation, because that is where clarity lives. The triangle feels protective but multiplies suffering. Recognizing it as it forms, when your voice performs, when your pain seeks an audience, is the threshold of integrity. Pause. Return to the line. Two people, without spectators, are the only ones who can speak truth that heals. Chapter 7. The Circle. Repetition, pattern, recurrence. Conflict rarely happens once. It returns in familiar shapes, the same argument, the same emotional charge, the same wound dressed in new circumstances. This is not misfortune, but the circle, the psyche repeating unfinished history. We are not fighting each other as much as fighting the loop. The circle persists not to punish, but to integrate what was once too overwhelming to feel. It returns until it is understood. 1. The circle begins with a core wound. Every life contains a moment when the self could not stay whole. Too young, too dependent, too unprotected. A truth was swallowed, a need unmet, a dignity undefended. That moment becomes a gravitational center. Beliefs and behaviors form around it, shaping how we interpret threat, safety, and love. When something in the present resembles the past, the wound pulls the psyche back into its orbit. The circle repeats because the original story was never completed. It returns to say, "See me." 2. The circle repeats because the old emotion was never expressed. The body holds what it could not express: the cry, the anger, the terror, the longing. The adult reacts through the child's unfinished movement, hiding, erupting, clinging, withdrawing, defending. What looks like overreaction is often the long-delayed release of a feeling once frozen. The circle is the body trying to feel now what it could not feel then. 3. The circle attracts familiar opponents. We imagine we choose people freely, but much of our choosing is unconscious recognition. We gravitate not to what's good, but to what's familiar. Emotional structures that echo the old wound. We select partners, rivals, and even political identities that replicate earlier dynamics, hoping to rewrite the ending. The circle is the gravitational pull of memory guiding our choices until the pattern itself is seen. 4. The circle intensifies with each return. Every repetition leaves residue: shame, resentment, exhaustion. With each cycle, escalation accelerates. The pattern contracts until conflict becomes identity. We become fused with roles: the victim, the rescuer, the judge, the abandoned one. 5. The circle breaks only when it is seen. The circle cannot be broken through niceness, strategy, or escape. Ending relationships, switching jobs, adopting new ideologies. None dissolve the pattern because the circle is internal. Recognition is the only break. This is not about now. This is the wound returning. Awareness slows the loop, weakens the reflex, restores choice. You shift from acting inside the pattern to witnessing it. Freedom begins when you see the pattern rather than embody it. 6. You do not break the circle alone. Because the wound is relational, the healing must be relational. Naming the pattern aloud, "I think we're repeating something older," changes the geometry. Two selves turn outward together, facing the pattern instead of fighting each other. You versus me becomes us versus the loop. Conflict becomes investigation rather than war. The circle is not mere repetition, but invitation. Memory seeking completion, identity seeking coherence. When named, its inevitability dissolves, and the past loosens its grip. In that release, the self finally returns to the present. Chapter 8. The Spiral. Escalation. The spiral is conflict in motion, friction turning into momentum, momentum turning into inevitability. Where the line is opposition, the triangle expansion, and the circle recurrence, the spiral is acceleration. Once triggered, conflict becomes a weather system, pressure rising, distortion multiplying, reactions amplifying. Gesture provokes reaction, reaction reshapes interpretation, communication dissolves into instinct. Soon the conflict sustains itself. Participants are carried by its force rather than guiding it. 1. The spiral begins when meaning collapses. Escalation starts not with shouting, but with misrecognition. The moment each person no longer feels seen. When empathy collapses, every gesture becomes a weapon. Tone, silence, memory, even narrative. The fight stops being about the issue and becomes about existence. Beneath the surface argument lies a deeper plea. Do I still matter to you? Do you still see me? When recognition fractures, the spiral ignites. 2. The nervous system switches to survival mode. As escalation rises, biology overtakes dialogue. Heart rate spikes, breath shortens, blood leaves the reasoning centers and rushes to the limbs. People are no longer exchanging ideas, but defending existence. Listening becomes impossible because the machinery for listening is offline. More talking intensifies the storm. The body is speaking louder than the mind. 3. Interpretation overtakes reality. In the spiral, feelings replace facts. Neutral gestures are read as hostility, ambiguity as contempt, memory differences as deceit. Heightened vigilance turns emotion into evidence. If I feel threatened, you must be threatening me. Sensation becomes truth because it is immediate and overwhelming. The conflict responds not to reality, but to fear's narrative. 4. Narrative becomes destiny. As interpretations harden, stories crystallize. You always do this. This is who you are. These are survival incantations meant to impose order on chaos. Once the narrative becomes destiny, the body behaves as if the prophecy is true. The conflict shifts from argument to myth. Participants defend the story more fiercely than the relationship. 5. The spiral feeds on itself. Escalation accelerates through positive feedback. Each reaction amplifies the next. Retreat interpreted as abandonment. Pursuit interpreted as attack. Criticism triggering shutdown. Shutdown triggering amplification. No one is wrong. Both are caught in a self-reinforcing system. The spiral is structural, not personal. 6. The only way to interrupt the spiral is to break motion. Because the spiral is kinetic, not intellectual, it cannot be solved through reasoning. Escalation must be interrupted somatically, slowing breath, lowering voice, softening posture, pausing before reacting. Physiological shifts break the momentum faster than insight. When the body slows, space opens, clarity returns. 7. The spiral ends when one person returns to presence. The spiral collapses when one person regains regulation and re-enters presence, not through surrender, but through grounded awareness. Presence is the gravity that counters acceleration. The steady person becomes the axis around which the storm begins to settle. This is the work of the mature strategist or grounded partner, sensing the acceleration, slowing themselves, restoring dignity before resolution. When the spiral exhausts itself, another geometry emerges: the wave, the deceptive ebb that follows every storm. Chapter 9. The Wave. De-escalation and fatigue. Every conflict breathes. After escalation peaks, physiology forces a downshift. Heart rate drops, adrenaline fades, breath deepens. This collapse forms the wave, the natural release following intensity. It is not maturity or surrender, but biology pulling the brake when the mind refuses to. The wave is ambiguous. It can heal or deceive. How we meet it determines whether conflict integrates or merely reloads. 1. Exhaustion is not peace. The silence after a fight often feels like calm, but it is usually depletion. The body has burned through its fuel and can no longer sustain aggression. This quiet resembles intimacy. Softer voices, gentler faces. Yet if the wound remains unspoken, the conflict is not resolved, only muted. The stillness is convalescence, not reconciliation. 2. The wave creates false lessons. In fatigue, the mind generates shortcuts that soothe discomfort but distort truth. Resignation disguised as wisdom, dehumanization disguised as clarity, emotional shutdown disguised as strength. These conclusions become the doctrines of the next conflict. A wave met unconsciously teaches the wrong lessons. Retreat earlier, attack faster, want less, demand more. Exhaustion becomes a counterfeit teacher. 3. The wave is an opportunity for integration. Yet collapse opens a rare window. With adrenaline drained and defenses softened, genuine truth can emerge without striking against rigidity. I was scared. I didn't feel seen. I was trying not to disappear. These are not arguments but releases. If met with awareness, the wave becomes the ideal moment for integration. Truth as exposure, not persuasion. 4. If the wave is ignored, the spiral returns faster. Mistaking the wave for resolution leaves the emotional charge intact. Each unintegrated conflict shortens the distance to the next. Triggers shrink. Escalation accelerates. A relationship that fights less may simply be suppressing more. Unspoken truth becomes pressure. The body rests only to reenact the same story later. 5. The mature self uses the wave to reassemble integrity. For the mature individual, the wave is not a break, but a workshop. This is the moment to breathe deliberately, soften the body, and ask, what was I protecting? What was I longing for? What memory was I fighting? This introspection turns fatigue into clarity. Once the inner landscape is understood, dialogue can resume without reigniting the spiral. Integration begins with orientation, remembering the self once threat evaporates. 6. The wave teaches the rhythm of conflict. Conflict has rhythm: charge and collapse, tension and release. Understanding this tide is strategic wisdom. The wave always comes. Even the fiercest conflict must exhale. What matters is how the quiet is inhabited. Those who rush to forget repeat the cycle. Those who pause to reflect reshape it. Used consciously, the wave deepens intimacy. Ignored, it guarantees recurrence. Every spiral leads to a wave, and every wave offers two paths: integration or return to the circle. The outcome depends on the consciousness brought to the quiet after the storm. Part 3. The psychology of conflict. Conflict is emotional architecture. Chapter 10. Identity and ego. Conflict threatens not the issue, but the self. Most fights are not about money, schedules, promises, or tone. They're about the self that feels endangered beneath them. Identity whispers its fear. Will I survive this with dignity intact? The ego is not vanity. It is the structure that keeps personhood coherent. It defends continuity, memory, role, narrative, against the threat of dissolution. To the ego, losing a conflict can feel like losing existence. 1. Identity is not a belief. It is a boundary. Identity is the invisible outline that separates me from not me, expressed in implicit expectations. This is how I am spoken to. This is how I am treated. This is who I am here. When conflict disrupts these boundaries, the body reacts as if under siege. We fight to remain ourselves in the presence of another, not simply for justice or understanding, but for continuity. 2. Ego is the guardian of identity. The ego's mission is coherence. When threat appears, it activates instantly, unconcerned with nuance. Its internal command is stark. If I yield here, I disappear. This is why defensiveness looks irrational from the outside. The ego is protecting shape, not argument. Beneath the refusal to soften lies the fear of dissolving as a self. 3. Two primary ego strategies: armoring and collapsing. Threat pushes the ego toward two instinctive strategies: armoring, hardening, asserting, escalating, controlling. Hidden creed: if I bend, I break. Collapsing, appeasing, withdrawing, self-erasing, apologizing reflexively. Hidden belief: if I express myself, I lose love. Both emerged as adaptations. Problems arise only when one becomes habitual, when the body forgets it has options. 4. The true danger: ego fusion. Ego fusion occurs when identity merges with the conflict. The person no longer has a fight, they become the fight. Their stance becomes their worth. Compromise feels like humiliation. Softening feels like annihilation. Resolution becomes impossible because solving the issue would require dissolving the identity tied to it. 5. The work is not ego death, but ego maturity. Ego is necessary. Without it, there is no stability or boundary. The task is not dissolution, but evolution. A mature ego that can hold two truths: my boundary is real, and so is yours. A flexible ego can tolerate discomfort without collapse, assert without aggression, and negotiate without self-erasure. Emotional sovereignty is this capacity to remain oneself without weaponizing identity. 6. The ego is stabilized from within, not by others. External reassurance cannot stabilize an unstable identity. True stability emerges when the self can say, I am safe to exist, regardless of how this conflict ends. This shift transforms conflict from existential threat to field of growth. A grounded self does not interpret disagreement as annihilation. Each argument becomes an invitation to evolve from self-protection into self-possession. When the ego learns that survival does not require domination, conflict stops feeling like death. It becomes what it always sought to be: a dialogue between dignities. Chapter 11. Humiliation and Pride. Conflict threatens personhood. Most fights are not about the surface issue, but about dignity, the felt sense of remaining someone in the presence of another. Humiliation is the collapse of that dignity, not embarrassment, but the experience of becoming small in one's own eyes. It whispers, I no longer exist in your view, and now I begin to disappear in mine. Nothing accelerates conflict faster. The psyche will endure fear or guilt, but not humiliation. And wherever humiliation appears, pride rises, not vanity, but armor. It says, you will not erase me again. Humiliation and pride form a twin system, the most combustible force in conflict psychology. 1. Humiliation is the memory of powerlessness. Present humiliation awakens older memories: parental contempt, romantic rejection, public scorn, ignored pleas. The rage that follows is not aggression for its own sake, but the refusal to collapse again. Humiliation is not about losing face to someone else. It is about losing coherence within oneself. The moment the inner voice whispers, I am no longer someone. 2. Pride is boundary defense, not vanity. Pride forms where humiliation once tore the self open. Healthy pride is self-respect, calm, secure, anchored. Wounded pride is volatile, sharp, defensive, inflamed. The difference is the stability beneath it. Mature pride protects boundaries with clarity. Wounded pride tries to prove those boundaries exist. Pride is the energy that defends dignity. Its morality depends on the self it protects. 3. The humiliation-pride feedback loop. Escalation often follows the same loop. One feels diminished, their pride rises. The expression of pride triggers humiliation in the other. Their pride rises. War. The argument becomes a struggle over dignity, not content. The question is not who is right, but who will remain whole. Minor issues feel existential because humiliation feels enormous. 4. The most dangerous conflicts are about meaning. People say, it wasn't what you said, it was what it meant. They are correct. The injury comes from what the act communicates about identity. I don't matter here. I am nothing to you. Humiliation implies erasure. Pride answers with overexpansion. When meaning is at stake, logic fails. Only recognition reaches the wound. 5. Repair requires dignity, not agreement. Conflict ends when dignity is restored, not when facts are clarified. Repair does not require surrender, only recognition. I'm not trying to make you small. I can see this mattered. I don't want you alone in this. Tone, presence, and posture are more powerful than explanations. Once dignity is stabilized, dialogue becomes possible. Without that, every word becomes disguised self-defense. 6. The most mature person protects both dignities. The immature stance. My dignity, not yours. The collapse stance. Yours, not mine. The mature stance. Both. This is not compromise but integrity. Strength without contempt. Clarity without cruelty. Protecting both dignities creates moral leadership, stable love, and peace. When dignity is recognized on both sides, conflict loses its existential charge. The self no longer fights to exist. The battle becomes a conversation. Exactly what conflict was meant to be. Chapter 12. The wound beneath the argument. Arguments are the surface. The real conflict lives beneath, in the old, unhealed injuries that animate tone, reaction, and meaning. What is unresolved does not disappear. It returns in new forms. We say, this came out of nowhere. But it comes from the layer where the self still bleeds under ordinary conversation. Until the wound is recognized, conflict reincarnates, louder each time. 1. Conflict is not about behavior. It is about meaning. Behavior is the doorway. Meaning is the room. Fights about chores, tone, timing, or boundaries are rarely about logistics. They are about deeper questions. Do I matter? Am I valued? Am I safe here? When conflict stays on behavior, it repeats. When it shifts toward meaning, the true issue emerges. Two people can resolve tasks forever and still fight, unless they understand what the conflict means to the other. 2. The wound usually begins in childhood bonding. Most adult conflict awakens injuries formed in early relationships, when identity was fragile and entirely dependent on others' regard. A child whose voice was ignored or punished learns scripts that feel like truths. My needs don't matter. Love must be earned. If I'm not needed, I'll be left. These internal narratives become the lens through which adult conflict is felt. The intensity of adult arguments comes from the weight of childhood wounds reactivated. 3. The argument is the child's old strategy reappearing. Every adult leans on a primary survival strategy learned in childhood: appeasing, controlling, performing, withdrawing, attacking. These are adaptations, not personality. Conflict destabilizes them. The very strategy that once preserved connection begins to fail, revealing the vulnerability beneath. What looks like adult anger or shutdown is often the sound of an old survival mechanism breaking open. 4. When the strategy fails, the wound is exposed. At a certain point in conflict, the old defense no longer works. Charm, logic, silence, dominance, retreat, all fail. What emerges is the exposed wound, the moment of unbearable visibility. This produces rage, collapse, numbness, not because the present conflict is catastrophic, but because the past has risen to the surface. If this exposure is met with recognition, healing begins. If met with dismissal, the wound deepens and the conflict becomes reenactment. 5. Naming the wound is the beginning of resolution. The wound does not require fixing, it requires seeing. Healing uses a different language. Something in me felt small. This reminded me of something old. I wasn't trying to win, I was trying not to disappear. Such statements reduce voltage. They shift the field from argument to awareness. Once the wound is named, the conflict changes shape, from surface dispute to an attempt to return the self to wholeness. 6. The most powerful healing in conflict is recognition. Recognition cannot be replaced by apology or explanation. It means seeing the human beneath the reaction. I can feel this touches something deep. I see the part of you that's hurting. You don't need to hide that from me. Recognition does not require agreement, only humanity. When the wound is recognized, the nervous system stops defending. The battlefield becomes contact. The argument is only smoke. The wound is the fire. Conflict ends not when one side wins, but when the fire is acknowledged. In that moment, conflict stops repeating and begins to transform itself. Chapter 13. Projection, Narrative, and Story. Every wound seeks coherence. When pain activates, the mind builds a story, not to reflect reality but to stabilize the self. This story is an emergency structure formed under emotional duress. Soon it becomes a world populated by roles, mythic logic, moral arcs, and imagined inevitability. The argument becomes theater. The wound becomes the scriptwriter. 1. Projection. Assigning the past to the present. Projection is memory searching for familiarity. When the present feels uncertain, the psyche maps the past onto the person before us. A tone becomes betrayal, a delay becomes rejection, a request for space becomes abandonment. We are not fighting our partner or colleague. We are fighting the ghost wearing their face. Projection reroutes today's conflict through yesterday's wound. 2. Narrative. The mind must make the conflict mean something. Once projection lands, the mind weaves coherence around it. You never listen. You don't care. Everyone leaves. These are not moment-specific statements, but global judgments forged from accumulated meaning. Narrative does not observe. It mythologizes. It stabilizes identity by turning the self and the other into fixed characters. Threaten the narrative, and the self feels threatened. Thus, the conflict intensifies. 3. Story. Conflict becomes myth. When narrative hardens, archetype takes over. One becomes the wronged one, the abandoned one, the one who cares more. The other becomes the aggressor, the selfish one, the one who never understands. The individuals stop relating and start performing. The conflict becomes a mythic reenactment driven by memory rather than presence. Logic cannot resolve a story already cast in archetype. 4. Narrative becomes self-fulfilling. Every narrative seeks evidence. If I believe you don't care, I withdraw. My withdrawal creates distance, and the distance confirms the story. Narratives become prophecies. Interpretation shapes behavior. Behavior creates proof. Proof reinforces the story. What began as meaning-making becomes a closed circuit of inevitability. 5. To break the spell, step out of the story. The core question in mature conflict work is not who is right, but what story am I inside, and who is this story requiring me to be? When awareness appears, identity loosens and the narrative loses authority. Simple acknowledgments pierce the spell. this feels old. I'm reacting bigger than the moment. I think I'm telling myself a story. Once named, the story softens, the air changes, drama becomes dialogue. The argument ceases to be fate and becomes something we can work with. Conflict transforms not through winning, but through recognition and narrative freedom. The moment we realize we were caught in a play and step off the stage. Chapter 14. The Addiction to Being Right. The most dangerous force in conflict is not anger or pride, but the psychological refuge of rightness. Being right offers the ego solidity when identity trembles. It protects against the terror of doubt and the humiliation of error. The conviction I am right becomes a fortress, which is why being wrong feels like collapse, not intellectual failure, but a threat to self-coherence. Conflict rarely endures because of the issue itself. It endures because rightness becomes a substitute for safety. 1. Being right protects against humiliation. Humiliation collapses dignity, and rightness becomes its weapon. To be right means no one can diminish you. Your interpretation becomes the authoritative reality. This is why people destroy intimacy, institutions, and peace to defend accuracy. Rightness is less about the argument and more about guarding identity from becoming small. 2. Certainty is physiological, not intellectual. When someone insists they know what happened, they're describing a nervous system bracing against vulnerability. Certainty is contraction, the jaw setting, the breath tightening. Loosening certainty would require feeling the old wound beneath it, so the body clings to rightness as protection, not as truth. 3. Rightness shrinks the mind. The need to be right kills curiosity, then empathy, then imagination. Nuance becomes dangerous. The psyche simplifies everything into binaries: good/bad, true/false, you/me. The partner becomes a symbol, not a person. Consciousness narrows into a tunnel in which identity must be preserved at all costs. 4. The price of being right is relationship. Where only one truth is allowed, connection dies. The other must submit, disappear, or rebel, all fatal outcomes. Rightness offers self-protection at the cost of intimacy. You may win the argument, but the world around you hollows. 5. Stepping out. From declaration to disclosure. The escape is not surrendering truth, but changing posture, moving from declaration to disclosure. Not, you meant to hurt me, but I felt hurt. Not, you don't care, but I needed care. This preserves dignity without demanding domination. It turns conflict from debate into dialogue, experience rather than accusation. 6. The mature self understands. Maturity recognizes that no one wins when connection is destroyed. Strength is staying in dialogue without needing to be superior. Integrity is tolerating ambiguity without losing coherence. I can be real without needing to be right. Conflict ends when both identities remain intact inside a reality wide enough for two truths. Chapter 15. The Self Who Can Contain Conflict. Some people can enter conflict without being consumed by it. They do not escalate or collapse. They do not harden or disappear. They remain grounded and permeable, stabilizing the emotional field through presence rather than force. They are not avoiding intensity. They can metabolize it. Containment is sovereignty, the capacity to hold conflict without amplifying it. 1. Containment is not suppression. Suppression feigns calm while burying threat. Containment is the opposite, staying present without being overwhelmed. It is steady breath, softened posture, open awareness. It does not exile emotion. It can hold emotion. The contained self says, "This intensity can exist, and so can I." 2. Containment comes from having met one's own pain. No one can hold external intensity if they fear their own internal pain. Those who avoid their shame, helplessness, or fear escalate quickly when conflict touches those edges. Containment belongs to the person who has faced their own depths and survived. They are not destabilized when conflict exposes what they have already met within. 3. Containment needs no audience. The contained self does not triangulate or perform. Their dignity is internal, and they do not need witnesses to stabilize their identity. Misunderstanding does not unmake them. They do not distort for sympathy or exaggerate for validation. They stand inside their own truth, quietly and clearly. 4. Containment regulates the field. Conflict creates a shared emotional atmosphere. When one person slows their breath, lowers their voice, and softens their body, the entire field recalibrates. Leaders, parents, lovers, those who stay present become the gravity others borrow. Containment transforms the room not by dominance, but by coherence. 5. Containment is active dignity, not passivity. The contained self is not submissive. They assert without aggression, protect boundaries without violence, express truth without collapse. They can stay connected without abandoning themselves, and stay themselves without abandoning connection. Containment replaces reflex with conscious action. 6. The contained self ends cycles. Because they do not escalate humiliation into pride or fuse identity with conflict, they interrupt generational patterns. Their steadiness becomes the axis on which old wounds soften and dignity is restored. They create a field where conflict becomes revelation rather than reenactment, a place where transformation becomes possible. Part 4. The movement of conflict. How conflict unfolds in real time. Chapter 16. Trigger, interpretation, reaction. Every conflict follows the same invisible sequence. Something happens, the mind assigns meaning, and the body reacts. The chain unfolds faster than thought. The chemistry shifts, breath changes, muscles brace, and by the time awareness arrives, the reaction is already alive. Conflict erupts not because of what occurred, but because of what the moment meant. The trigger is neutral. Interpretation is emotional. Reaction is physiological. This sequence is the engine of escalation, from quiet domestic tension to geopolitical rupture. 1. The trigger is almost always small. Conflict rarely begins with large events. It begins in tiny, ambiguous moments: a tone, a silence, a glance, a delay. These sparks awaken an old injury, and the injury awakens identity. The trigger itself is trivial, but it touches memory, and memory ignites the nervous system. The spark is not the real issue. It is simply the key that unlocks stored emotional charge. 2. Interpretation happens instantly and unconsciously. The mind does not observe, reflect, then respond. It interprets first. A brief gesture becomes a complete story. They don't care. They're controlling me. They're pulling away. Interpretation arises from past experience, not from present clarity. Once the meaning arrives, it feels like fact because it echoes lived history. 3. Reaction is the body obeying meaning, not reality. After interpretation, the body mobilizes. Heart rate rises, breath shortens, muscles tighten, tone sharpens. The nervous system reacts not to what happened, but to what the meaning declared. This is why reasoning fails. The conflict is no longer intellectual, but somatic. The body is already in defense. 4. Conflict persists because we treat interpretation as truth. Interpretation whispers, "This is what this means," and the psyche follows it unquestioningly. Each person defends a private meaning rather than the actual interaction. These meanings were shaped long before the present moment, so both sides end up arguing with memory rather than each other. The conflict becomes a battle of inner maps. 5. The chain breaks at the interpretation stage. We cannot prevent triggers or stop instinctive flinches, but we can intervene where the conflict actually forms, in interpretation. One question slows the sequence. What else could this mean? This shifts the conversation from accusation to exploration. I felt unnoticed. Can we talk about what happened? Something in me tightened. Can we slow down? I'm reading your silence as distance. Is that true? This softens certainty and returns curiosity to the room. 6. Awareness doesn't eliminate conflict. It changes its nature. The goal is not to sterilize conflict, but to remain conscious within it, feeling the trigger, noticing the meaning, watching the surge, and choosing the response. This turns conflict from a repetition of old pain into a moment of revelation. Compulsive conflict reenacts the past. Conscious conflict reveals truth, restores dignity, and deepens connection. Awareness doesn't prevent the fire. It teaches the self how to stay present inside its heat. Chapter 17. Tone as weapon, tone as shield. Words are surface, tone is depth. Tone is the audible shape of the nervous system, breath, cadence, pauses, tension. It reveals emotional reality before meaning forms. Two people can speak identical sentences, yet only one version heals, because conflict lives not in language, but in the atmosphere surrounding it. Tone decides whether words become pathways or blades. 1. Tone determines whether the body opens or closes. The nervous system listens for tone before it hears content. Warm, steady tone softens the body. Breath deepens, muscles release. Listening becomes possible. Sharp, pressured, sarcastic, or cold tone contracts the system instantly, signaling danger before words land. Conversations fail not because content is wrong, but because tone shuts the body down before logic can arrive. 2. Tone is the first weapon in conflict. Tone wounds more efficiently than words. A sigh of contempt, a clipped ending, a judgmental pause. These microsignals say you are beneath me without using a single insult. Tone communicates hierarchy, dismissal, and humiliation faster than language. It's how you said it. Is the nervous system reporting the real injury? Tone strikes at identity, not ideas. 3. Tone is also the first shield. A grounded tone offers protection, not domination. It says, I'm here. I'm not leaving. I'm not trying to diminish you. This tone allows anger without rupture and vulnerability without collapse. It stabilizes the field so both people can remain human. Tone as shield is not performance. It is regulation made audible. 4. Tone reveals whether the self is present. The voice of the wound is reactive. Shallow breath, hurried cadence, tightened jaw. Its tone says, I'm protecting myself. The voice of presence is slower and anchored. I can stay here. I don't need to run. Tone shows whether the self is centered or fragmented. Leaders, parents, partners, negotiators, those who hold presence do so first through tone, not argument. 5. Repair begins with tone, not words. Apology and logic cannot reach a nervous system still reading threat. Repair begins when tone communicates safety and recognition. Your dignity is intact. I'm not your enemy. Simple phrases. I'm here. We can slow down. Work only when delivered through regulated tone. Tone reopens the body. Without that, words bounce off armor. 6. To change conflict, change tone first. Before adjusting arguments, adjust physiology. Slow the exhale. Drop the shoulders. Loosen the jaw. Allow silence. Then speak from presence. Slower, grounded, intentional. This is not submission. It is authority. The person who governs tone governs the emotional field. Tone leadership is emotional leadership. Change tone, and the entire geometry of conflict shifts with it. Chapter 18. Escalation Mechanics. Escalation feels chaotic, but it follows a predictable structure. A ladder the nervous system climbs step by step. Conflict moves through trigger, meaning, threat, defense, rupture. With the same inevitability, a spark becomes flame. To see the sequence is to diffuse it before it erupts. Escalation is not personality failure, but biology and meaning interacting at speed. 1. Trigger. Every escalation begins with something tiny, a tone, a silence, a look. Nothing catastrophic has happened, but the nervous system registers danger before thought arrives. A door opens, not to conflict itself, but to the possibility of it. 2. Interpretation. The mind fills the ambiguity with meaning pulled from memory. They don't value me. They're shutting me out. They're trying to control me. The interpretation feels like clarity, but is reflex. The moment remains small. The meaning becomes immense. 3. Identity threat. Once meaning fuses with selfhood, escalation truly begins. The question shifts from what happened to what does this say about me? Dignity contracts. The self feels diminished. Escalation is fueled not by anger, but by the terror of becoming small. 4. Defensive posture. Physiology takes over. Breath tightens, muscles brace, voice hardens. Dialogue disappears. Survival modes activate. Fight, flight, freeze, appease. Conflict crosses from psychology into metabolic reaction. 5. Reciprocal defense. One defensive signal triggers another. Two nervous systems mirror each other in a closed-loop activation cycle. Each believes they are defending themselves. Neither can hear. Escalation gains momentum independent of intention. 6. Meaning expansion. Intensity demands explanation, so the mind widens the frame. You always do this. This is who we are. This relationship has always been like this. The present collapses under old memory. The moment becomes a reenactment. 7. Moralization. Pain becomes righteousness. I'm the reasonable one. You're the selfish one. The conflict shifts from what happened to who each person is. Once morality enters, resolution becomes nearly impossible. Identity is now the battlefield. 8. Totalization. The stakes become existential. If you don't understand this, we're finished. The entire relationship is pulled into the fight. Belonging and safety are suddenly on the line. Emotional rupture approaches. 9. Break. No system can sustain that voltage. The escalation collapses into one of three forms: explosion, attack, shouting; withdrawal, silence, disappearance; collapse, tears, numbness. The break is not resolution, it is overload. 10. Fallout, freeze. After the break, calm appears but is actually distance. The system enters a frozen state of unresolved charge. The bond becomes brittle. Without integration, the next rupture arrives faster. Why escalation feels unstoppable. By the time identity is threatened, the body believes it is fighting for existence, not preference. No one is talking to the present moment anymore. Both are speaking to their ghosts. Where to intervene? The critical fulcrum is between interpretation and identity threat, before meaning becomes personal, before dignity shrinks, before physiology takes the wheel. One question interrupts the entire chain. What did I feel this meant? Not who started it, not who is right, but what meaning the nervous system assigned. This question breaks the automatic sequence and returns choice. It is the moment where escalation ends and transformation begins. Chapter 19. Dominance, retreat, freeze. Before any word is spoken, the nervous system has already chosen its stance. Conflict begins not with intention, but with reflex. Move forward, move away, or go still. These strategies predate language and appear across all humans, not as personality traits, but as survival patterns wearing the clothing of narrative. Each contains wisdom, each carries cost, and each shapes how a conflict unfolds. 1. Dominance, the forward response. When threatened, some bodies move toward the source. Posture rises, gaze sharpens, voice intensifies. Dominance is not aggression, but protection. If I can control the field, I can stay safe. Its strengths: clarity, decisiveness, the ability to face intensity without collapsing. Its shadow: empathy thins, tone hardens, and the other person's dignity can be flattened under the weight of control. Dominance may win the moment and lose the relationship. 2. Retreat, the withdrawal response. When danger feels too overwhelming, the body steps back. Eyes lower, voice softens or disappears, breath thins. Retreat says, if I reduce exposure, I can stay intact. Its strengths: it cools the field, prevents impulsive damage, creates space for regulation. Its shadow: the other may experience it as abandonment or indifference. Unspoken truth accumulates into resentment. Nothing explodes, but nothing deepens. 3. Freeze, the immobilization response. When neither fighting nor fleeing feels possible, the system goes still. Breath holds, muscles lock, expression flatlines. Freeze says, if I disappear, I cannot be harmed. Its strengths: it buys time, reduces danger, protects against overwhelm. Its shadow: emotional absence, misread as coldness. One partner present, the other vanished. Freeze stops harm, but also stops connection. 4. No strategy is wrong. The question is awareness. Dominance, retreat, and freeze are intelligent biological programs. Problems arise only when they operate automatically. Without awareness, people reenact the same choreography of hurt, mistaking reflex for personality. Awareness turns instinct into choice. 5. The mastery is in the shift. Mastery is not staying calm or avoiding instinct. It is agility, the ability to move between strategies intentionally. Establish a boundary with grounded dominance. Step back to cool the field with retreat. Pause intensity with a conscious moment of stillness. Then return to presence. This is emotional strategy at the level of the body, choosing the next move rather than replaying the old one. 6. The most dangerous dynamic. Every intimate bond tends to pair a dominant with a retreater. Each activates the other's fear. Dominance sees retreat as rejection. Retreat sees dominance as threat. The more one advances, the more the other withdraws. A self-reinforcing pursuit-flight loop that drains the relationship, not through explosions, but through exhaustion. 7. The point of mastery. The loop breaks only when each instinct evolves. Dominance becomes grounded presence rather than pressure. Retreat becomes visible boundary rather than disappearance. Freeze becomes conscious stillness rather than shutdown. When instinct becomes awareness and presence replaces reflex, conflict stops being collision and becomes choreography. This is emotional sovereignty, governing one's interior world so the shared world can stay intact. Chapter 20. Stalemate, Exhaustion, and the Silent War. Not all conflicts burn. Some freeze. From the outside, a relationship may look calm, but the stillness is paralysis, not peace. A stalemate forms when both sides reach the limits of emotional endurance. Neither can push without breaking. Neither can yield without feeling erased. Nothing resolves. Nothing erupts. Everything simply stops moving. This is the silent war. Distance mistaken for maturity. Numbness mistaken for forgiveness. Structure surviving while aliveness dies. Many relationships end not through betrayal, but through frost. 1. Stalemate is a joint freeze response. Both people feel raw, unheard, and afraid that speaking will make things worse. Neither can retreat without feeling small, nor move forward without feeling exposed. So they hold position, silent, dignified, paralyzed. It appears peaceful because there is no fighting, but it is really two nervous systems locked in vigilance, connection suspended rather than restored. 2. The danger. The relationship begins to rewire. As the freeze persists, the psyche adapts. The body stops reaching. The heart stops revealing. Vulnerability becomes unsafe. Connection shifts from intimacy to function, polite, efficient, hollow. Lives run in parallel rather than intertwined. Separation is never announced, yet it has already begun. The relationship continues in form, but loses its current. 3. Stalemate drains the system. Stillness looks restful, but it consumes enormous energy. Resentment simmers. Longing dries into numbness. Disappointment becomes identity. People tell themselves, "This is just who we are now." That is not peace. It is emotional malnutrition. The longer numbness endures, the harder it is to thaw. Most relationships die not in storms, but in deserts. 4. The silent war teaches a false lesson. Over time, the nervous system adopts a dangerous belief. Speaking is unsafe. Silence is safer. This is not maturity, it is shutdown. Needs shrink. Desires fade. The self begins to erase itself to avoid stirring the field. What began as protection becomes disappearance. 5. Breaking the stalemate requires return. Stalemate cannot be broken by analysis, apology, or "we need to talk." Those reawaken the vigilance that froze everything. What breaks the stalemate is simple and courageous: return. Return means re-entering the emotional space without demand or pressure. I'm here. We can go slowly. I don't want to lose this connection. Return is presence, not problem-solving. It invites instead of pushes, allowing safety to reform. 6. The one who returns leads. The first to return is not weaker. They are the leader. They carry enough inner stability to offer contact without collapsing or demanding. This is not appeasement, but sovereignty. The strength to restore connection while keeping one's dignity intact. This is how frozen fields thaw. This is how the silent war ends. This is how intimacy returns, quietly, through the disciplined generosity of presence. Chapter 21. The Pivot. When conflict turns toward resolution. The pivot is not an agreement. It is a return to contact. Conflict does not fade like mist. It turns. One moment the nervous system is braced, and each person is defending a story, and then something shifts, an exhale, a brief softening, presence returning like light to a sealed room. This turning point, the pivot, never comes from argument or logic. It appears the moment one person stops speaking from defense and begins speaking from the unguarded truth of their inner life. And the striking thing is that only one person needs to move. A single regulated nervous system changes the field for both. When someone says, in tone more than words, "I'm here. This bond still matters," the body on the other side recognizes safety before understanding the language. Contact returns long before the content resolves. The pivot requires vulnerability without collapse. This turn depends on vulnerability, but not the collapsing kind, the defeated, "fine, you win," or the self-erasing apology spoken through resignation. Vulnerability in the pivot is upright, the spine steady, breath grounded, gaze clear. It sounds like a truth spoken without armor. I felt afraid of losing myself there. I still want to be connected even inside this tension. This is not fragility. It is maturity, the appearance of the self without defensiveness or performance. The pivot cannot be forced. Yet the pivot cannot be pulled into existence. You cannot pressure someone into softening, nor schedule emotional openness by demanding it. Attempts to coerce the turn usually deepen the conflict, because pressure activates the very defenses that must relax. The pivot emerges only when someone quietly decides, "I would rather be real than right." That internal shift, small, invisible, entirely voluntary, opens a door no amount of argument could touch. The pivot requires one condition: dignity is safe. For this moment to arrive, dignity must feel protected. No human being can soften while sensing contempt, a sharp sigh, a dismissive tone, an impatient silence. Dignity is the gatekeeper of openness. If it feels threatened, the gate closes. When dignity is guarded on both sides, the nervous system no longer needs to brace. The field becomes safe enough for truth to appear, and the possibility of repair enters the room. The pivot is followed by a softening, not a solution. Once the pivot occurs, the atmosphere changes subtly but unmistakably. Shoulders lower, Breath lengthens. The eyes meet without hardness. But this is not the moment to solve everything. Solutions offered too early often feel like intrusion. The softening itself is the medicine. After presence returns, clarity emerges naturally. What felt impossible 10 minutes earlier becomes obvious because fear has released its grip. The pivot is the heart of conflict transformation. To understand the pivot is to understand the hidden rhythm inside all conflict. When you can sense its approach and stop forcing outcomes, conflict stops feeling catastrophic. You begin to see it not as the collapse of connection, but as the psyche straining to reconnect beneath layers of defense. The mature self learns to wait for the pivot, to breathe instead of brace, protect dignity on both sides, speak from presence rather than the wound, and allow the emotional field to steady before searching for answers. The pivot does not end conflict through victory or surrender. It ends conflict by returning two defended selves to the humanity underneath their armor. From that moment onward, what was once combat reshapes into dialogue, and what was threat becomes intimacy. Part 5. Resolution. Conflict completes only through repair. Chapter 22. Repair and Reintegration. Repair is not apology, nor is it a sentimental wish to return to the past. It is the slow reweaving of the emotional fabric that conflict has pulled apart. The restoration of trust, safety, recognition, and the sense of mattering, all of which become frayed when two selves collide. Conflict strains the threads that hold a bond together until the relationship feels unstable or thin. Repair is the act of weaving those threads back into coherence. It is not something done to the other, but something done with them. It does not erase the wound, it integrates it. In this way, repair is not the conclusion of conflict, but its evolution. The moment a relationship becomes wiser than it was before. 1. Repair begins only after the pivot. No repair can land on defended ground. If either person is still armored, tense, righteous, numb, or braced, the field is too brittle for truth. This is why early attempts so often fail. Let's talk about it feels like pressure. I apologized feels like dismissal. Let's move on feels like abandonment dressed up as composure. Repair begins only after dignity is restored on both sides, after presence returns. The work before repair is not conversational, but physiological. Breath softening, tone slowing, eyes seeing a person rather than a threat. Only then does repair have a place to root. 2. Naming what actually hurt. Repair begins with naming the emotional truth beneath the argument. Not the storyline, not the logic, not the historical record, but the felt experience. I felt unseen. I felt small. I felt alone. I felt unsure of my place here. These are disclosures, not accusations. They do not demand agreement. They ask only to be witnessed. And when the wound is seen without defense, the nervous system begins to release the charge it was holding. Healing starts the moment truth is named and met with presence rather than rebuttal. 3. The two questions that transform repair. Once the emotional truth is on the table, two questions open the heart of the conflict. What were you protecting? What were you longing for? These questions bypass the ego's theater of blame and go straight to the core. Protection reveals dignity, autonomy, worth, or an old fear of erasure. Longing reveals tenderness, the wish to feel chosen, equal, safe, accompanied. When each person speaks from these roots, the battle dissolves. The argument stops being about accusation and becomes a meeting of two nervous systems trying to stay whole. Beneath conflict, two self-protective strategies are revealed, and a shared desire to remain connected without losing oneself. 4. Repair requires mutual ownership without self-condemnation. Ownership in repair is not guilt or self-blame. It is clarity. It sounds like, I see how my tone closed the space. I see how I pulled away instead of staying present. I see how I reacted from fear. This is responsibility without collapse, honesty without humiliation. And it must be mutual. If one person carries all the ownership while the other carries none, repair becomes hierarchy, not restoration. True repair requires reciprocity, each acknowledging their part, not to assign blame but to restore transparency and dignity. 5. Reintegration. Bringing the lesson back into the relationship. Reintegration is the quieter but deeper stage, the folding of the conflict back into the relationship as wisdom rather than residue. Two people ask, what did this reveal about us? What pattern surfaced? What need must now be honored? How do we move differently next time? This transforms conflict into teacher, and teacher into intimacy. Insight becomes connection, connection becomes maturity, and maturity strengthens the bond. Reintegration ensures that the conflict does not repeat as a ghost in the future, but returns as understanding in the present. 6. Repair is not a return to how things were. Repair is not regression. To return to how things were is to set the relationship up for repetition. Repair must carry the bond forward, turning unconscious patterns into shared awareness and reactivity into sovereignty. Conflict becomes the forge of deeper connection, not the enemy of intimacy, but its proof. Without repair, tension stagnates into resentment. With repair, tension becomes renewal. To repair is to say, we remain, we grow, we choose each other again, consciously. And this, all along, is what conflict was trying to make possible. Chapter 23. Boundaries that hold without hardened walls. Boundaries are not fences meant to exile others, nor threats disguised as limits. They are the invisible agreements that keep the self from dissolving while staying in connection. Most people confuse boundaries with distance, punishment, or control, issuing ultimatums rather than truth. Don't speak to me like that. If you do that again, I'm leaving. These are walls born of panic, not boundaries born of presence. A true boundary says quietly, this is what I need to remain myself while staying connected to you. It protects dignity without shutting down warmth, sovereignty without severing intimacy. Without boundaries, the self erodes in the effort to keep peace. With walls, warmth dies and repair becomes impossible. Real boundaries are the middle path, open yet intact, connected yet sovereign. 1. A boundary is a declaration, not a demand. A real boundary defines your own action, not the other's. It does not require their compliance to exist. It requires only your clarity. Instead of stop yelling, it becomes, if voices rise, I'll pause and return when we're regulated. Instead of don't ignore me, it becomes, if silence stretches too long, I'll check in once and then re-engage later. A boundary is a posture of self-respect, not an attempt to alter the other. Its power comes from embodiment, not enforcement. 2. Boundaries are not negotiated. They are revealed. You do not ask permission to be whole. You reveal what wholeness requires. And the tone matters. If fear sharpens your voice, the boundary becomes a threat. If steadiness grounds it, the boundary becomes sovereign truth. Regulation comes first, breath slowing, jaw softening, weight rediscovered in the feet. And then the boundary emerges calmly, without argument or apology. It is not a debate. It is an articulation of selfhood. 3. Boundaries are not hard. They are flexible with integrity. Walls are rigid. Boundaries are alive. Their essence stays constant. I will not abandon myself to maintain peace, while their expression adapts. Sometimes you stay and speak. Sometimes you pause. Sometimes you listen without rushing to respond. Flexibility is not fragility. The behavior shifts. The self does not. This is strength without rigidity, presence without self-erasure. 4. Boundaries without warmth become barricades. A boundary delivered without warmth feels like exile. To protect connection, the limit must be paired with reassurance. I need a moment. I'm here and will return. Or, I care about this. Let's slow down so we can understand each other. Warmth signals that connection remains intact. The boundary protects the self. The warmth protects the bond. 5. Boundaries are the opposite of control. Control says, change so I don't feel pain. A boundary says, I can stay whole even when discomfort arises. Control demands compliance. Boundary expresses consciousness. Control shapes the other. Boundary clarifies the self. This is the difference between domination and dignity. Boundaries make honesty possible because the self feels safe enough to stay present. 6. Consistency turns boundaries into culture. A boundary spoken once is a statement. A boundary lived consistently becomes the emotional culture of the relationship. Most connections do not fail due to a lack of love, but due to the slow buildup of self-abandonments and unspoken truths. When boundaries are steady, the nervous system relaxes. Each person knows where dignity lives, where truth can land, where the self can stay whole. And where the self is whole, intimacy can grow without distortion. Boundaries are not barriers to closeness. They are its frame. Without them, one person disappears. With walls, both do. A living boundary says, I will stay with you, but I will not leave myself to do so. This is how conflict becomes safe, how connection matures, and how love retains its clarity and strength. Chapter 24. Forgiveness that does not betray the self. How to release resentment without erasing truth, dignity, or memory. Forgiveness is widely misunderstood. People imagine it demands forgetting, excusing, reconciling, or returning to a past that no longer exists. They treat it as a moral duty that requires swallowing pain and pretending the wound is gone. But forgiveness is none of these. It is the quiet act of releasing the emotional burden of injury while refusing to deny that the injury occurred. Forgiveness is for the self. Reconciliation, if it ever comes, belongs to the relationship. Forgiveness unhooks identity from pain, loosens the narrative that held the wound in place, and frees the psyche from bitterness without erasing memory. It is not the erasure of history, but the end of captivity. 1. Forgiveness does not begin until the pain has been witnessed. No one can forgive what they have not fully felt. The wound must be named, understood, and honored before the psyche can release it. Attempts to forgive quickly are not forgiveness. They are self-abandonment dressed as virtue. Real forgiveness comes only after the self has been seen, either by another or by one's own awareness. and dignity has been restored. 2. The true enemy of forgiveness is not anger, it is shame. Anger protects boundaries. Shame collapses them. Shame fuses the injury to identity. This happened because of who I am, and traps the self inside the wound. As long as shame remains, forgiveness is impossible. Only when self-respect returns can the emotional burden be released. Forgiveness requires standing upright, not kneeling. 3. Forgiveness is the moment the story breaks. To survive pain, the mind creates a story, complete with heroes, villains, reasons, and roles. Over time, the story becomes a cage. Forgiveness is the moment the story loosens and is recognized simply as narrative, not destiny. The memory remains, but the self steps out of the myth it once lived inside. The heart becomes spacious again. 4. Forgiveness does not require an apology. Your freedom cannot depend on someone else's insight or remorse. You can forgive someone who cannot acknowledge the harm, who is unable to change, or who remains unsafe to meet again. Forgiveness is internal unbinding. It does not require contact, agreement, or reconciliation. This is sovereignty. 5. The internal shift of forgiveness. Forgiveness is felt as a shift inside the body. This happened, but it is not who I am. The emotional gravity lifts. The nervous system unclenches. Breath returns. The self steps out of the past and back into the present. Forgiveness is the reclamation of presence, not amnesia. 6. 2 kinds of forgiveness. A. Without reconciliation. The wound is released, but distance is maintained because the relationship cannot hold safety. B. With reconciliation. Forgiveness is paired with slow rebuilding, accountability, honesty, consistency. This is not naive return, but conscious repair. Both forms are valid, and both are grounded in self-respect. 7. The self that forgives is not weak. It is fully formed. Real forgiveness demands strength, the ability to remember without reliving, to feel without collapsing. Forgiveness from a weakened self is appeasement. Forgiveness from a stable self is sovereignty. It declares, I remain myself. The past no longer defines me. Forgiveness is not surrender. It is the release of emotional captivity without denying truth. It is not forgetting. Forgetting erases the self. Forgiveness restores it. It is not reconciliation. Reconciliation must be earned through changed behavior. Forgiveness is the quiet emancipation of the heart, the moment memory becomes history rather than destiny. From here, the self regains its breath, its clarity, and its authority. Forgiveness is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of sovereignty, the moment when the past loosens its grip and the self rises without bitterness, ready to move forward with dignity intact. Chapter 25. The renewal of the bond. When conflict completes its full cycle, escalation, exposure, recognition, repair, reintegration, and forgiveness, something deeper than recovery becomes possible. The relationship does not simply return to what it was, it reforms at a truer, more stable level. A bond rebuilt through truth and dignity becomes anchored not in fantasy or fear, but in awareness and choice. Renewal is this transformation. 2 people who have seen one another without disguise and still choose to remain. 1. True intimacy begins where illusion ends. Before conflict, many bonds are quietly shaped by projection. Old childhood myths, idealized roles, and unspoken expectations. Conflict tears these illusions apart. Though painful, this collapse creates the first real chance for intimacy. The question becomes, can I love who you actually are, not who my history imagined you to be? When the fantasy falls away and the real person is seen, flawed, complex, human, intimacy shifts from myth to reality. Renewal begins with this clarity. 2. Renewal requires two things: presence and continuity. Renewal is not automatic. It requires presence, the willingness to show up emotionally, and continuity, the decision to stay. Presence without continuity flickers. Continuity without presence starves the bond. Together they create the conditions of safety. I am here. I remain. When both persist through discomfort, trust roots itself again and the nervous systems of both people resync. 3. Renewal changes the structure of the relationship. Once renewal takes hold, the architecture of the relationship shifts. Honesty no longer threatens survival, and vulnerability is no longer interpreted as a risk. The bond becomes less reactive and more grounded. Conflict is no longer a threat to belonging. Instead of walking on emotional glass, each person feels enough solidity to tell the truth. The relationship becomes a container sturdy enough to hold two full selves. 4. Renewal does not mean harmony, it means capacity. Conflict still appears, but it is no longer catastrophic. Because the relationship has endured rupture and repair, it now has elasticity, room for tension without panic, difference without collapse. Renewal does not eliminate storms, it gives the relationship rigging strong enough to hold through them. 5. The symbol of renewal, the shared inner world. Every relationship that survives rupture carries a quiet inheritance, the memory of having gone into the dark and returned together. This shared experience becomes inner strength, an invisible landmark. We found each other again. It becomes emotional bedrock, making the bond feel lived, not imagined. The relationship has depth because it has survived a small death and revived. 6. Renewal makes the bond anti-fragile. Fragile bonds break under pressure. Resilient bonds endure. But a renewed bond, conscious, repaired, and integrated, becomes anti-fragile. It grows stronger because of pressure. Conflict becomes not a threat to intimacy, but the forge that tempers it. This is the final movement of conflict's evolution, a bond that can hold truth without shattering, protect dignity without rigidity, and choose connection without illusion. Renewal is not the end of conflict. It is the beginning of a relationship mature enough to contain it. Conflict becomes the fire that strengthens the bond, the crucible where love stops being idealized and becomes real. Epilogue: the quiet after the storm. Conflict cannot be erased, nor should it be. It is not the enemy of love or peace. It is the forge where identity sharpens, intimacy deepens, and relationships become real. Peace is not the absence of tension. It is the ability to stay present inside it. A life without conflict would be a life without depth, no friction to shape growth, no honest meeting of selves. The aim is never to eliminate tension, but to move through it without collapsing, attacking, or abandoning oneself. Conflict reveals what is true. It shows where story ends and self begins, where the ego tightens and where the heart is willing to open. It tests whether dignity can remain intact, whether vulnerability can breathe under pressure. whether connection can survive exposure. Each conflict is a crossroads, repetition or evolution. To navigate it with steadiness and clarity is to become someone no longer frightened by intensity or hijacked by old wounds. You become someone who stays whole in the presence of rupture. This is quiet sovereignty, not dominance, but the stability of a self that does not desert itself. The work of this book has been to reveal the architecture beneath conflict, the mechanisms that determine whether we reenact the past or transform it. Understanding this architecture is not the conclusion. It is the threshold. Conflict mastery, the practice. This is not a method, and it is not a technique. It is a way of returning to yourself in the exact moment conflict tries to pull you away. Think of it as a quiet inner sequence, a practice you can revisit until awareness becomes instinct. When conflict begins, pause long enough to notice what your body is doing. Tightening? Holding breath? Bracing? Ask yourself what meaning you assigned before a single thought had time to form. Ask what else the moment could mean. Stay with the sensation before creating a story around it. When escalation rises, look inward again. Are you protecting your dignity or trying to control the field? Is your tone opening space or tightening it? Slow your exhale before you speak. See if you can glimpse the human being beneath the other person's defense. When the wound appears, let yourself recognize it. What does this remind you of? What part of you is being protected? What longing is surfacing? If you can name this without accusation, simply, honestly, the moment begins to shift. When repair becomes possible, check whether dignity has been restored for both of you. Speak from presence, not from the wound. Name the truth that needs to be named for closure. Stay long enough for the other to soften. This is how connection begins to return. After the conflict, reflect gently. What did this reveal about you? What did it reveal about the bond itself? What will you practice differently next time? And can you hold even a small gratitude for what this conflict showed you? About your history, your reflexes, your sovereignty? This practice is not a performance. It is a returning. A way of meeting conflict without leaving yourself. A way of letting the moment shape you toward clarity rather than repetition. Return to it whenever you need. Return to it until returning becomes natural. Return to it until presence becomes your instinct. Bookend.